A lot of families carry things that don't show up in shots. Not being sick, not being poor, and not having trouble you can place and name. It was earlier than that, like eye color or the shape of your jaw, something that gets passed down from one family to the next. It's not in the blood, though. It's in the quiet, in the things that people don't talk about at dinner. Like a grandmother who jumps when the wind suddenly changes direction. I need to know something before I go any further. Where are you at the moment? In your area, what time is it now? Enter it in the box below. I read all of them. Some of you are in places that sound like they fit in much worse stories than this one. Let me tell you the story of the we. When I'm done, you'll know why it was never meant to leave the plains. A person named Obadiah. Y came to the area that would become western Kansas in the spring of 1851. He came by himself. Not a wife. There were no complaints. There was just a man on a horse with a leather trunk strapped to the saddle and a look in his eyes that made the few people who saw him on the trail feel uncomfortable. Not crazy or in a hurry. Set on it. The way a man looks when he knows exactly what he wants to do, and nothing can change his mind. It looked like Obadiah's face was put together from different parts. He was 41 years old, tall, and had raw bones. Of other faces, a nose that was too pointy, a forehead that was too big, and a mouth that leaned to one side when he spoke, as if the words had to fight to get out. No matter how he combed his hair, it grew in all different ways. It was the color of dry wheat. His hands had long nails and were always moving. They were tapping on his thigh or the saddle seat, as if they were keeping time to music that no one else could hear. He was from Pennsylvania. No one knew before that. Obadiah didn't talk about what came before Pennsylvania. The few people who did ask got such a blank look that they didn't ask again. He claimed 640 acres of open land about 30 miles south of a trading post that would grow into a town. People who came from places with hills and trees got lost because the land was so flat. Ahead of them, there was nothing that could be seen. It was only grass, which was tall and green in the summer and brown and brittle in the winter. There was a wind that never stopped. It looked like the sky above was so big that felt like they were going up for some people. Obadiah didn't seem to care about any of this. He made a soda, a house out of cut blocks of prairie turf. It was low, dark, and half hidden in the ground, like the den of an animal that didn't want to be seen. He drilled a hole. He prepared the ground for crops and waited for something no one knew about. A group of homesteads about 12 miles northeast, grouped around a crossroads people called Bellinger's Ford, was the closest town, even though there was no Ford and no one named. People who lived there were mostly hard-working wheat farmers with sun-scorched skin and constant squints. Bellinger had lived there for years. People whose lives were based on the seasons, the amount of rain, and the price of grain. They saw Obadiah like you see a new fence post coming up behind you. He was there. He had never been there before. They didn't think much more about it after that until the first winter. By any measure, the winter of 1851-1852 was very harsh. It became so cold below zero that temperature gauges lost all of their liquid and didn't show any changes for weeks. The wind pushed the snow to the side, and in minutes it could take away a man's warmth. The cattle got cold while standing up. The fence posts were buried by snow. Families huddled together in their Saudis, burned anything they could find and hoped for spring. Every family except the Wees. During the worst of it, Obadiah was seen outside on his 640 acres by himself. A man named Thaddeus Grieve ran a small cattle ranch close to. Jack Bellinger, who drove Bellinger's Ford, said he saw Obadiah walking slowly across his property in the driving snow as if it were a warm April afternoon. Obadiah was wearing only his shirt sleeves and no coat, hat, or gloves. Thaddeus looked through a crack in his shutters and squinted against the white. He said that Obadiah wasn't carrying the leather trunk, but something smaller and wrapped in cloth. He also said that Obadiah wasn't walking in a straight line, but in a pattern of precise turns. He moved slowly, as if he were drawing a form on the ground that only he could see. Someone told Thaddeus about this, and the people he told nodded and put it in the strange but not their business pile. Strangers, like lone men who wanted to forget their pasts, liked the fields. It was a part of the land. It got springy. Obadiah grew wheat. This is where the story starts to go in a way that no one saw coming. His wheat grew. That doesn't sound interesting until you find out what it was like to grow wheat on the fields in 1852. The ground was rough. The bugs wouldn't go away. The weather was a threat that came at you from all sides at the same time. In a good year, most homesteaders lost a third of their crop. In a bad year, they lost half or more. Some years, everything ended, and you were left with debt and a strong will. His wheat grew tall, golden, and thick like a mat. Not a single worm, blight, or patch of, rust, smut, or any of 100 other diseases that every farmer within a day's ride had. The grain buyer at the trading post stared at his wagon as he brought in his first crop because it was so big. He asked him how many acres he had planted. People didn't believe what Obadiah told them. Every year after that, whether it rained or snowed, the second year was the same, the third, and so on. No matter what bad things happened on the fields, Obadiah's land was safe. His wheat grew like it was getting food from something other than soil and water, as if the ground below his land had promised to produce no matter what the weather was like above. Even though many people spoke out about it, no one did anything about it. On the border, people valued luck almost as much as they valued hard work. Oh well, if Obadiah knew a farming trick that none of them did, that was his business. After that, he got married. In 1858, Obadiah rode to the trade post and came back 3 weeks later, with a wife. The girl's name was Lavinia. Born Lavinia Poole. Lavinia. Y was 26 years old, short, and had dark hair. Her face would have been pretty if it wasn't so still. You can tell she was still because it felt purposeful, like she had trained herself not to react to anything. It looked like her eyes were almost black and brown. They looked at everything with a care that made people feel like they were being watched instead of being noticed. Missouri is where she was born. After that, she didn't share anything else with anyone. Bellinger's Ford was brave to talk to Obadiah's wife. She moved in with the Saudi and wasn't seen much after that. Thaddeus Grave's wife, Permelia, rode out once to greet Lavinia and bring her a bunch of nuts. After 2 hours, she came back looking very pale. Permelia was not the type of person who got upset quickly. She had kept her cool through 3 desert winters, a grass fire, and a fight with a rattlesnake in her kitchen. But that visit made me feel uneasy. Her. She told Thaddeus that the Saudi was not right on the inside. That's not dirty, not badly kept, or wrong. The sizes did not make sense. Based on its outside measurements, the room didn't look as big as it was on the inside, and it was set up in a way that felt planned but awkward. Every piece of furniture was set up at an angle that made you look at the heavy curtain hanging from the ceiling to the floor on the back wall. Permelia said she didn't know what kind of fabric the curtain was made of. It's dark and heavy, almost like leather, but not quite. It was Lavinia who she asked what was going on. The king smiled. No one asked her what that meant. She just said, "That's where we keep what the land gives us." She said that something in Lavinia's smile told her not to ask, because it would be a mistake she couldn't fix. She left. She didn't go back to the Y house. She also told Thaddeus that they should not bother with what was going on in that house. Years went by. The Wise had a kid. First a son, then a girl. Wait, I'll fix that. Over the years, Obadiah and Lavinia had 3 children. All 3 showed up as adults working on the property, 2 men and a woman with the same way name and the family's unique quiet. The first one was called Ezra and showed up in 1864. He was a tall, 20-year-old guy with the sharp nose of his father and the black eyes of his mother. After 2 years, Hosea came along. He was shorter and wider than the first one, and his mouth was like a brick. Could make a horseshoe out of iron bend. The third was a 21-year-old woman named Zervia. She was thin and had straight back. Her hair was so dark that it looked blue in some lights, and her voice sounded like it came from a well. That's it for now. This is the part of the story where things start to change. Pay attention, please. Nobody in the neighborhood ever thought of these 3 as anything but adults. There was no pregnancy, no family members coming to visit, and no wagon pulling up with new. Friends and family. It had 2 people one season, 3 the next, 4 the next, and finally 5 the following season. It looked like the Wise were building up instead of growing. Every new member looked at you with the same stillness, watchfulness, and way of looking that made you feel like they saw something about you that you hadn't seen yourself. The wheat got taller every year. By 1870, property had grown in ways other than buying more of it, through a slow, quiet takeover that no one could quite figure out. Proof or a dare. The fence lines changed. The boundary signs moved. People who used to farm land next to the Wheeze noticed that their plots had shrunk, as if the ground were moving to make more room for the Wise. When Thaddeus Grieve tried to talk to Obadiah about a piece of grazing land that he was sure had been his, Obadiah showed him an old, worn-out deed that looked like it could fall apart in your hands. The act was legal, or at least it looked like it was legal. The writing, the seals, and there was a county stamp, and everything was fine. Thaddeus agreed with it. He had no choice. But that night, he told Permelia that when he looked into Obadiah's eyes during the talk, he saw something that gave him more chills than any winter wind. He said there was a kind of patience in those eyes that I could not understand. Having the patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time and wasn't in any hurry. She should have been 70 years old by 1880. It didn't look like him, he looked. The same as it was when he got there in 1851. The same rough bones, sharp nose, and wheat-colored hair. In that same shaky beat, even his hand kept tapping, tapping, tapping. Lavinia also didn't look old. She ought to have been 48 years old. She looked 26 years old. The black eyes, dark hair, and face were all the same. On the plains, no one spoke. People saw you, even though you didn't care about them, and that seeing turned into something heavy, something that stuck in your gut, like a rock. Now I need to tell you who is telling you the story. There is fear behind you that you are hearing. Please help me if you've read this far into the W.H. Lee story. Click subscribe. Really, it helps us keep telling these stories. If you hear this on a channel that isn't ours, they took it without our approval. Tell us about it. We worked hard on this. Okay, let's go back to the plains. Because what came next is where this family's secret began. Crack open. After 40 years, in the fall of 1891, a guy named Mart Schofield came to the area. Mart, who was 37 years old and from Topeka, used to work as a clerk for the train. He quit after an accident broke 3 fingers on his left hand and made it impossible for him to use the telegraph. His face was round, his eyes were brown and quick, and his beard hung down past his chin. He wasn't very tall. He walked with a slight limp from another accident that he never talked about, and his low, steady murmur was him talking to himself under his breath. Depending on the person, they found it cute or annoying. Merritt bought 40 acres next to the Way property site without being able to see them from the Topeka land office. He got there expecting to find open grassland that was good for grazing. He discovered an open grassland that was good for grazing and bordered by the most unsettling farm he had ever seen. At this point, the farm took up more than 2,000 acres. The first Saudi had been changed out for a real house with 2 stories and a wood frame. It was painted a dark color that Merritt couldn't quite place a reddish red that made him think of dried blood, but he told himself it was just in his head. The house was in the middle of the land, like the shape of a heart. All around it, a wheat field that was so green and uniform that it was impossible to believe it was dry. Each stalk was the same height and each row was the same distance apart, making it look like they were put by a machine that hadn't been made yet instead of people. The family grew bigger. Others had joined Obadiah and Lavinia and their 3 new children. On any given day, Merritt saw at least 9 people moving around the land. There were some things they all had in common, like being still, having watchful eyes, and moving slowly as if every step had been planned ahead of time. They also didn't seem to be getting older. When Merritt met Obadiah on his 3rd day, he was shocked by how wrong things were, and he felt that way for the rest of his life. This man had been. For 40 years they farmed this land. He should have been old, stooped, and worn down. He instead looked like a man in his 40s. He was strong and stood straight, and his eyes and hands were clear. His hands were still tapping, always tapping. Merritt tried to be a good friend. It was his turn to talk. He offered his help. He asked the Wise to come to Bellinger's Ford for a harvest party. Every time they tried to get close, they only got a polite nod and a grateful word. The Wise did not come, indeed. Do not trade. They didn't go to church, social events, or any of the other activities that kept Plains communities together in the face of the vast, empty environment. They lived apart, and the land around them did well. On Merritt's land, it did not. His first crop didn't grow at all. Everything was eaten by grasshoppers. His second crop was better, but most of it died before it could be picked because of a late frost. Even though the green should have been good for them, it made them thin. His well water turned bitter. He couldn't stand the taste. Every little bad thing that could happen to a homesteader started to happen to Merritt Schofield so often that it felt like it was personal. Across the fence, the Y wheat grew tall and golden without being touched at all. Merritt started to watch, but not on purpose at first. She watched it in the way that you look at something over and over again until you can't figure it out. At night, he would sit on his porch with his bad hand on his knee and his good eye on the wheat fields. He would look at what he saw and try to figure it out. After that, he began to watch carefully. He started writing in a small book wrapped in leather that you could carry in your breast pocket. He wrote down everything: the family's whereabouts, the state of their crops, the animals that lived nearby, the weather, dates, and times. These were all details that didn't seem important at first, but over the course of weeks and months they started to fit together in a way that scared Merritt. For example, he said that no birds settled on thee. So why property and not one? Around every other fence post for miles, merks, hawks, and crows got together to make a lot of noise in the plains. But there was nothing on the walls. There was nothing on the roof. There was nothing in the sky above their fields. As water flows around a stone, birds flew around the property, splitting up at the border and meeting again on the other side. It was like something in the air above that land kept them away. He also said that the wind blew differently there. The wind in the plains never stopped. It was whirling and gusting from all sides, but over the fields it moved in one direction, toward the house. It was like the house was breathing, slowly drawing the air toward itself in a way that never stopped or turned around. The shadows of the Whaley family didn't quite match their bodies, he said. It wasn't a big deal or something you'd notice at a glance, but Mart, looking through his field glasses in the late afternoon, saw that the shadows were always a little ahead of the people who cast them when the sun was low and the shadows were long. They seemed to know where the wise were going before they did. Even though these things bothered him, it was the right that really shook him up about the world. Every seventh day, the whole family got together in the wheat field next to the house. From the middle, they stood in a shape that wasn't a circle or a line, but something in between, a spiral, in the middle and going outward. From dusk until it was completely dark, they stood there still and turned inward. When the last bit of light left the sky, they all knelt at the same time, as if answering to a message that Mart couldn't see or hear. When they pressed their hands flat against the ground, the wheat around them moved, but it wasn't because of the wind. Those nights there was no wind. Even though the air was still, the wheat moved. It leaned in toward the family and curved, as if it were being pulled by a gravity that had nothing to do with the earth's pull and everything to do with what the whales were eating during their ritual. Have you ever seen something that your mind just wouldn't understand? Something your eyes saw but your mind sent back marked, "Return to sender"? That's what Mart talked about, he said. His eyes saw the wheat moving. They saw it bend, reach, and almost writhe, but his brain wouldn't believe it. His pencil was stuck in the middle of a sentence as he sat on his porch and watched the impossible happen. That was all he could think about. He kept hearing the same word over and over in his head. No, 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 no. It took about an hour to do the process. The family stood up, walked back to the house in a straight line, and went inside when it was over. It was like nothing happened when the door shut. The lamps went out, and the wheat went back to standing straight. Mart made a list of everything. Also, he wrote down that the next morning, the piece of wheat where the rite had taken place was noticeably taller than it had been the day before. Not just a little bigger. 1 or 2 inches taller than before. This went on for months in a single night. Things changed during the winter of 1892, when the ground was frozen and the wheat was dormant. The family stopped getting together in the field. They stayed inside the house instead. However, Mart could see something through the windows from his home in Topeka, thanks to a pair of field glasses he had bought there. Moving shadows, the shapes of people standing in a line inside the house, and a light that wasn't a lamp or a flashlight. As if something were living and breathing under the house, the light pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. It looked like firelight coming from below, from the floor, or maybe from under the floor. The light changed the house. At times, it looked like the air around the Y house shimmered, like how air shimmers above hot ground in the summer. The only difference was that it was December and very cold outside. The sparkle changed the house's shape, making it look bigger, and the walls seemed to. Take a deep breath and stretch. The windows lit up so brightly that they hurt Mart's eyes, even through his field glasses and from a mile away. Each time, he took his glasses off and pressed his palms against his eyelids while he waited for the picture to go away. He saw a pale circle that pulsed in his mind, like being in the sun for too long. December 21st, 1892, was the longest night of that winter. The light got so bright that Mart could see it from his porch almost a mile away. Every window let it in. Of the Y house, that pale, pulsing light, and the whole land was lit up for a split second. In that light, Mart saw something that would stay with him forever. It was December, and the ground was frozen, and the sky was dark with cold. The wheat was growing through the snow and frost, green and full of life. It was spreading out from the house like water waves. He watched it move across the field, seeing the frost melt and the snow melt away in front of it. It was grotesque how quickly the stalks rose from the ground. It was wrong in every way a live thing could be wrong. The light then went out, and the wheat was gone. It looked like nothing had happened because the field was empty and frozen again, but the lines that marked the edges had moved. There was a check the next morning. His land was 4 acres smaller than it was the day before. He went to Bellinger's Ford in the spring of 1893 and asked some questions. A lot of people didn't want to talk. They changed the subject or remembered that they had errands to run. When Merritt said the name Wage, a woman in the general store turned her back on him. A farmer who was putting grain on a wagon slowly shook his head and shut his mouth. It seemed like everyone in the town had agreed, without saying it, to forget about the biggest property in the area. Instead of not knowing, they did it to stay alive. The way your body learns to ignore pain that won't go away because noticing it makes it worse. One man did talk, though. His name was Enoch, A. Parterdy. Enoch was 69 years old and had been living in the area since before the war. He was thin and had leathery skin. He had 2 wives who died before him and lived longer than most people his age. Also, he looked like a man who had stopped being scared of things because he had none left. He had known Owadia for a long time. He had seen the WH property grow from a single sooty to a huge business that took over the land around it. He also had an idea. With cups in hand, they sat on the porch of Enoch's ranch house, of cold coffee. The porch faced south, across the street from the WH ranch. You could see miles and miles of wheat from here on a clear day. It was a golden smear on the horizon that never got smaller or browned and never showed a single gap or flaw. Enoch looked at it while he talked. That way, a man looks at a fire not because it's interesting, but because it feels risky to turn away. He spoke slowly and picked his words out like a person crossing a frozen river. Before the trading posts, the railroad, and the wheat, this land belonged to people who had a different view of what it meant. People who knew this land was more than just dirt. That living thing was in it. Not a spirit or an animal in the sense that the preachers used the word. Something basic, something that was always there, like how heat is always there in fire. Something old, vast, and uncaring about people, like how the weather is always uncaring. It couldn't be changed, though, unlike the weather. He told Enoch that Obadiah knew this when he got there, and that he hadn't just happened to be in this land. He had gone looking for it. He had something in that leather trunk that was given to him by someone who had done the same deal with someone else in a different place and time. And when Obadiah got there, he had already put forward the terms under which the land would always produce enough. The land would be given in exchange. Merritt questioned what was needed. Enoch didn't say anything for a long time. He finally said, "Time, it. It does take time, but not the way you think. Also, it doesn't age them, it makes them better. The family gets bigger, but not because of babies. All over the land. They are stronger because of the land. They are filled by the land. And each year they change into something less like people and more like what more?" Merritt kept going. Enoch turned to look at the sky. The grass was moving back and forth in the strong wind. Everything below the sky seemed small and short-lived because the sky was so big. Enoch said it was more like the land, like wheat that wears a person. Shape that talks, walks, and smiles. On the bottom, though, it's just roots that go so deep you can't even picture them. Something that was here before people and will be here after them has roots in the ground. Merritt asked what she could do to stop it. Enoch almost laughed. Merritt had never heard a sound so barren and sad. Enoch said again, "Stop it. Son, don't break a deal like that. The land always gets together. It's only a matter of how much you owe." he went home that Mart evening. He sat on his porch and watched the sun go down behind the WH property and tried to make sense of what he had heard. The logical part of his mind, the one that knew how to use telegraphs and railroad schedules, insisted there had to be a reason. Their land had better soil. They knew how to farm in a way that no one else did. The family just didn't want to be seen, and that makes people suspicious. There was another part of his mind that believed Enoch. It was older and knew things before his reason did, in every way. On his land that night, Mart heard something he had never heard before. There was a sound coming from under his floors. Not a living thing or the sound of wood settling. Slow and steady, like a pulse, it sounded like something under the ground was breathing. Moving from the direction of the Y property, the sound went through the ground like a wave passing under his homestead and kept going eastward, as if the whole prairie were a body and the sound was the beating of its secret heart. The water in his well tasted sweet again in the morning, after not tasting that way in 2 years. Also, the line marking his property had moved another 6 feet toward his house. In the spring of 1893, Mart Schofield sold his 40 acres and left the area. The deal went through quickly. A man from Wichita bought the land. He had never seen it and didn't ask any questions. Mart only paid about half of what the house was worth. It didn't bother him. He wanted some space. He wanted bricks and pavement, as well as the sound of other people talking and the noise of a city where the ground was all muddy and you couldn't get to it. Now he lives in Denver. As a clerk in a dry goods store, he measured fabric and counted nails, among other small, safe, repetitive tasks that kept his mind off of the plains to the east. He married Crisa, a quiet 31-year-old woman with steady hands and practical eyes. She never asked him about his past, because she could tell from the look on his face that he had locked it away and forgotten about it. Important. They lived in a small apartment that was above a bakery. Because bread is made from wheat, the smell of it in the morning became Mart's favorite thing in the world. But it was wheat that had been changed, broken down, and put back together again into something safe and healthy that didn't whisper, pulse, or grow in frozen ground. The next 41 years were small, careful, and not very interesting for him. But he kept the journal, and when Mart was 80 years old and dying in 1934, he gave the journal to a reporter named Leland Kemp at a mountain hospital in Denver. Leland was scruffy and hungry for a story. He was 29 years old. He worked for a small newspaper in Denver that wrote about strange things happening in the area and interesting people. There was a nurse who told him about Mart. She said the old man kept talking about a family on the plains that never aged and wheat that grew in the winter. Before he died, Leland went to see Mart 3 times. Mart told him more about the sounds, the light, the moving lines, and the rituals each time. Under the ground. Mart grabbed Leland's wrist with strength that wasn't normal for a man his age, and told him over and over, "Don't go there. Write the story if you want, but don't go there." Leland, who was 29 and hungry, went there anyway. He used someone else's Ford to get from Denver to western Kansas. It took 2 days to drive. As he moved, the land became flatter, losing its mountains and foothills like a person losing clothes, until there was only the open, raw prairie. Leland could feel an emptiness in his chest as he looked up at the sky and down at the road. The road was as straight as a ruler. He slept badly at a motor court outside of a town called Glay the first night. He had a dream about wheat. It wasn't a bad dream, it was just wheat, a gold, tall field of it. As he walked through it, the warm stalks rubbed against his arms and face. Body warmth, or the temperature of live skin, not sun warmth. It was morning when he woke up and looked at the time. 3:14 in the morning. There was no light around him, so he lay there and thought about why he had agreed to do this, He saw Merritt's face in the hospital. The old man's eyes were wide, scared and desperate to be believed. He had a stronger hold on Leland's wrist than a dying person's hand should have had. "Don't go there. Write the story if you want, but don't go there." Leland got back on the road early in the morning. What did he find? Bellinger's Ford? What was left of it? A grain mill, a few mostly empty buildings, and a gas station run by Rowena Fitch, a 63-year-old woman who had lived there her whole life. Rowena was fat and pale from the sun. Her arms were thick, and her voice sounded like a bell across the plains. When she looked at Leland, her patience was worn thin, like someone who had to answer too many questions from strangers. Rowena didn't change her face when Leland asked about the WH property, but her hand stopped moving. The counter had been cleaned. Her hands stopped. She stood there with the rag flat against the wood for a few seconds before she spoke. She said that the WH land was still there, 12 miles to the south. She said the wheat was still getting bigger. The family was still there, she said. That made Leland wonder how it was possible. Obata had not been there for more than 80 years. She looked at him in that way that people do when someone asks a question that they already know the answer to. The mailman said, "I don't go out there. Nobody goes out there." Deliveries are left at the junction, and after dark, someone comes and gets them. The buyer of the grain sends a truck once a year, and the driver never leaves the truck. The money shows up in the bank the next day after he opens the trunk and lets them load it. They are not seen up close. They don't get any talk. There are no questions. Why did Leland ask? People who ask questions fall behind. "Not in a figurative way," Rowena replied. "Their fence lines move, their wells dry up, and their animals lose weight. The land takes back what it gave them. It protects the quiet from those who are interested." She paused. Plus, the last person who drove out there without being asked about 15 years ago came back different. He didn't say what he saw. Next week he sold his house, packed his truck, drove east, and never came back. He did stop at this bar before he left, though, and said something to me that I'll never forget. He told Leland, "The family is the harvest, not the wheat." Leland still drove out there. The road going south from. Bellinger's Ford wasn't paved and wasn't well taken care of. There were 2 ruts in the grass that his Ford reluctantly followed, bouncing and wobbling across the flat area. The sky was huge, with a dome of gray clouds pressing down on the plains. The wind was blowing all the time, pushing against the side of the car so hard that it made him lose his grip on the steering wheel. It took him about 40 minutes to see it first. First came miles of wheat that went in every direction from a center point that Leland couldn't see yet. Look, it was almost chest-high, taller than any wheat he had ever seen, and it was uniform in a way that didn't make sense. Every stalk was the same, and every row was perfectly spaced. The whole field moved in the wind like a single creature breathing. It wasn't quite golden either. It was a bit red and warm, making Leland think of skin glowing in the sun. It was beautiful, but it made him feel bad, like when something is too perfect, too symmetrical, or too living. He went into the wheat field because it was stuck because the road went right through it. The stems touched the car's sides. They made a noise that wasn't like the dry rasp you'd hear from wheat in the fall. It was like every plant that touched the metal was trying to say something in a voice that was too quiet to hear. As you got closer, the house slowly rose from the wheat, like a ship rises from the water as you get closer. It was bigger than Leland thought it would be. Dark red, 2 floors, with a porch that went all the way around. All 4 sides and windows that let in gray sky that looked like empty eyes. The paint looked great. The wood was strong. The top was straight. There was no damage or wear. It looked like the house was just put together this morning. And in front of the house, 9 wise men and women stood in a line on the porch. They were all perfectly still as they watched Leland's car come through the wheat, but they weren't looking aggressive or friendly. Wait, this is how the land looks. That waits like the seasons do, or like something that has been waiting for 80 years and doesn't know when to hurry. Leland put the car in park. He stayed behind the wheel for a long time. His book was on the couch. He had his pencil in his hand. His door was shut. And every nerve, every instinct, and every old alarm that nature had built into humans all told him the same thing. Don't get out of the car. He saw a family sitting on the porch. A lot of money. I'm still watching. The man in front of them, in the middle of the line, was tall and had wheat-colored hair. He had a sharp nose and a mouth that turned to the side. Abada lived in this land for 83 years. He looked 41, exactly as Merritt had described him, exactly as he had looked in 1851. He didn't look a day older, and there wasn't a single line or gray hair on his face. Only his eyes spoke for him. Leland could see them from this far away. They were wrong. They had eyes that were either dark or green, or a color in between. Depth. They were flat and level, like paint on something that didn't need eyes but learned to wear them because that's what people thought it would look like. The family didn't move. They didn't say anything. They did nothing but watch. Leland also felt something he couldn't put his finger on. Weave. Not physical, it's more than that. It was like the land itself was telling him to stay, like the ground beneath his tires was reaching out to him. What a hand does when it wants to hold something. Wind blew through the wheat and into the car. Pushed. Leland could feel a rhythm or pulse beneath the noise, the stress, and the gray sky. It was the same pulse that Merritt had talked about, the heartbeat of something huge, patient, and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with ownership. He turned the car around. On the gear shift, his hand was shaking. He put his foot on the gas pedal. The engine was turning over as he slowly and carefully drove back through the wheat field. He kept his eyes on the road behind him in the rearview mirror, and attempting not to observe the family sitting on the porch. He failed. There was a pull in his eyes that made him keep coming back to them. They were moving, though. They didn't move at all. There were 9 figures on a porch watching him leave. Not a single one of them moved their weight from one foot to the other, opened their mouth, or raised their hand. They stood there like fence posts, plants, and things that had grown from the porch itself. They would stay there long after the nails were gone and the wood was rotting. Rusted, and the house fell apart in the ground where it stood. The wheat touched the car. The whispers got louder, and Leland saw something in the mirror that broke him for a moment. There was less wheat behind the car. The tracks his tires had made were getting smoother. The stalks were straightening out and going back to their perfect rose shape, covering up his tracks as if he had never been there. It was like the land was absorbing the signs of his presence like a body takes in a wound. He drove. He did. He didn't stop until he got to Bellinger's Ford. Rowena was working behind the bar. She looked at him, then poured him a glass of water without being asked. He sat there for a very long time. His hands were shaky. On the passenger seat of his car, his notebook was still open. The page was empty, and the pencil was still wet. He didn't write anything. He hadn't written anything down. And as he tried to remember the family, the house, and the wheat, they were already getting fuzzy in his mind. Not like how memories fade, but like how dreams fade. The harder he tried to grab it, the farther it slid away until all that was left was the pull, the pulse, and the feeling that something huge, patient, and very, very old had looked at him and chosen to let him go for its own reasons. The woman next to him saw him drink the water. He agreed when she told him, "You went." There was another nod when she said, "You came back." That's the thing about the wheeze. Most people come back. They don't need to keep you. They've got the land. They already have whatever lives under all of that wheat, that thing that Obadiah negotiated with when he first knelt down and put his hands in the dirt, offering whatever he offered in exchange for what he got. They don't need anything else. They just want to be left alone. But the land keeps growing, she said. Leland asked what she meant, and Rowena pointed east, then west, then north, then south. She said that the property was about 2,000 acres when she was born, but now it's closer to 8,000 acres. It grows every year, a few acres here and there, slow and quiet. No one fights it because there's nothing to fight. The deeds are always in order, the boundary lines are always legal, and the county records always match. It's as if the paperwork rewrites itself to keep up with the land. She paused. "Sometimes I wonder," she said very quietly, "how big it'll get if there's a limit. If whatever Obadiah bargained with has an appetite that can be satisfied, or if it just keeps eating slowly and patient, acre by acre, year by year, until there's nothing left but wheat, the family that tends it, and the thing that makes it all grow." Leland Kemp drove back to Denver, but he never wrote the story or talked about what he saw on the W.H. property. Merritt Schofield's journal sat in a drawer in Leland's apartment for 26 years, untouched, unopened, and gathering dust. He died in 1960 at the age of 55, and his cause of death was listed as a stroke. But his landlady, a sharp-eyed woman named Odelia Brandt, Leland had become obsessed with the floor of his apartment in the weeks before he died. He pressed his ear against the floorboards every night and moved the rug so he could feel the wood directly. And the last time Odelia saw him alive, he told her that he could hear it again. It was a faint pulse that sounded like his own heartbeat, but it wasn't coming from inside him. It was coming from the ground, from far to the east, where the land was flat and golden, and the wheat grew tall. The family still stood on their porch and watched, patiently waiting, as the soil that fed them and the land kept growing. Maybe it's still growing. If you went to western Kansas right now and found the road south of what used to be Bellinger's Ford and followed the ruts through the grass until the tall, red-gold, whispering wheat showed up, you might find the house, the porch, and the family still there. They were still standing there, watching with their faces and eyes still, and their hands always moving in time with the pulse of the soil. Obadiah, Lavinia, Ezra, Hosea, Zerviah, and all the others, those who came after, those the land added, those who are now more wheat than flesh, more root than bone, and more earth than human. Maybe you'd find them. Or maybe the land would find you first and you'd feel that pull, that gentle invitation, that warmth. I wonder what it would take and if you'd say yes. Think about it tonight when it's quiet, when you're lying in bed and the only sound is the floor creaking. Ask the land to stay with you and promise that everything will grow, thrive, and be provided for as long as you are willing to kneel. Press your hands into the dirt and offer whatever it needs. Ask yourself what you'd give to live a life where everything went right, where every seed you planted grew, and where the land loved you back. Then listen. Really listen. Because maybe, just maybe, if you're quiet enough, you'll hear it too, that pulse beneath everything waiting. That was your fear. If this story stuck with you or made you think about what's under the ground you're standing on right now, share it with someone. And if you have your own story, something strange, that took place somewhere no one talks about, send it to us. It might be the next story we tell. Until then, stay above ground and don't kneel under any circumstances.